Some people think a spare key gives them ownership. That mistake cost my HOA president everything. The smell of wet pine and cold lake water hit me the second I stepped out of my truck that night. It was 11:47 p.m., 43 degrees, and the gravel under my boots crunched sharp in the mountain silence as I stared up at my grandfather's cabin. Every light inside was on. Not porch lights. Not the old motion sensor over the garage. Every single light. Kitchen. Living room. Upstairs loft. Even the lamp beside the stone fireplace glowed amber through the windows like someone had been settling in for hours. My hand tightened around the paper coffee cup, warming my fingers. I hadn't told anyone I was coming back early. Not the neighbors. Not the HOA. Definitely not Linda Carrington. A gust of cold air rolled down from the ridge, carrying the smell of chimney smoke and cedar sap. Then I saw movement behind the curtains. A shadow crossed the living room. Slow. Comfortable. Like whoever was inside belonged there. I killed the truck headlights and stood still for a second, listening. The distant hum of a generator echoed across the lake. Wind hissed through the trees. Somewhere down near the dock, metal tapped softly against wood. Then came laughter. A woman's laugh. Calm. Familiar. My stomach tightened immediately because I knew that voice. Linda Carrington, Pine Hollow HOA president. Queen of fake smiles and legal threats. I walked up the stone path toward the cabin, my boots damp from the thin layer of melting snow still clinging to the edges of the trail. The porch light flickered above me as I reached for the doorknob. Locked. Good. Exactly how I left it 3 weeks earlier after replacing every lock on the property. The deadbolt. The keypad. The dock chains. Even the bridge gate half a mile down the access road. That's when I heard the click behind the door. The deadbolt turned from the inside. Slowly. The door opened 3 inches, spilling warm firelight across the porch. And there she stood. Linda Carrington. 52 years old. Blonde hair perfect even at midnight. Cashmere sweater. Wine glass in one hand. My cabin key in the other. For 3 full seconds neither of us spoke. The fireplace crackled behind her. I could smell expensive perfume mixing with burning oak from inside the cabin my grandfather built with his own hands back in 1974. Then Linda smiled like she was greeting an inconvenience instead of a homeowner. Ethan, she said smoothly, you really should have told the HOA you were coming back tonight. I looked at the key dangling between her fingers. Old brass. Scratched near the handle. One of the originals my grandfather handed out years ago before he realized giving people access was the same thing as giving them entitlement. How did you get in? I asked quietly. Her smile widened. Community access privileges. Then she lifted her phone from the kitchen counter behind her. Red and blue reflections flashed across the front windows before I even heard the sirens climbing the mountain road. Linda took a sip of wine without breaking eye contact. I already called the police, she said. You changed the locks on shared HOA property. The cold air suddenly felt thinner in my lungs. I glanced past her shoulder into the living room and immediately noticed something else. Mud on the hardwood floor. 2 extra wine glasses on the counter. HOA paperwork spread across my grandfather's dining table. She hadn't just entered my cabin. She'd been using it. Behind us, headlights cut through the trees as sheriff deputies rolled into the driveway, tires crunching over frozen gravel. Linda folded her arms confidently. This should be interesting, she said. But the second one of the deputies stepped onto the porch and asked why she had a key to my private bedroom door, I watched the color drain from her face for the very first time. Deputy Collins looked from Linda to me, then back to the brass, key hanging in her hand while cold air drifted through the open doorway behind us. The red and blue patrol lights washed across the snowbanks lining the driveway, turning the pine trees into flickering shadows against the mountain ridge. Linda recovered fast. People like her always did. Her smile snapped back into place so quickly it almost looked rehearsed. Deputy, this cabin has always been shared access property for Pine Hollow residents, she said smoothly. Mr. Walker changed the locks without notifying the association. I could hear the faint crackle of the radio clipped to Collins' shoulder as he studied the deed folder tucked under my arm. His partner, Deputy Ramirez, stood near the porch railing watching Linda carefully now, especially after that question about the bedroom key. The silence between them had changed. You can always tell when law enforcement starts realizing a situation is not what the loudest person claimed it was. I leaned against the doorframe and looked past Linda into the cabin. The old grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily through the room. Same clock my grandfather bought from a retired railroad worker in 1981. The smell of cedar smoke still drifted from the stone fireplace, while melting snow dripped quietly from Linda's expensive leather boots onto my hardwood floor. That bothered me more than the police lights outside. Funny how small things get under your skin when somebody treats your family home like a country club lounge. Shared access. I finally asked. Linda, my grandfather let neighbors fish off the dock 20 years ago. That does not make this community property. Her jaw tightened for half a second. Tiny crack in the armor. Then she folded her arms again. The HOA has maintained access rights for years. There it was. Access rights. Not ownership. Not easement. Not recorded use agreement. Just vague words designed to sound legal enough to intimidate people. My grandfather warned me about people like Linda when I was 12 years old, standing beside him on the dock while he repaired fishing lines under a gray October sky. He always said mountain communities attracted two kinds of people: folks who respected the land and folks who wanted to control it. Back then, Pine Hollow barely had 30 homes tucked around the lake. Gravel roads, aluminum fishing boats, old men waving from porches. Then came vacation investors, luxury cabins, HOA fees, and people like Linda Carrington driving up from Denver with designer hiking boots that had never touched mud. The first thing she ever said to me after becoming HOA president 3 years earlier was not hello. It was, that cabin would make an excellent community lodge someday. I remember the exact smell in the air when she said it too. Fresh asphalt from the newly paved entrance road and gasoline from landscaping equipment. She had stood there in oversized sunglasses staring at my grandfather's cabin like a realtor pricing inventory. After Grandpa died, things escalated fast. Residents suddenly started accidentally wandering onto my dock. HOA newsletters mentioned future lake expansion opportunities. Then Linda started telling new homeowners the cabin had historically served as shared community access. A lie repeated often enough starts sounding official to people who never asked for paperwork. But I did ask. 6 months earlier, I drove straight to the county records office in Fairmont. 3 hours digging through easement filings, plat maps, and archived deeds while dust floated through old fluorescent light. What I found changed everything. No recorded easement. No shared use agreement. No HOA ownership claim. Nothing. Just my grandfather's deed sitting untouched since 1974, with one sentence typed near the bottom that would eventually destroy Linda Carrington's entire little empire. Deputy Collins finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "do you mind if we step inside and look over those documents?" Linda's smile disappeared completely this time. The cabin always sounded different after midnight. The old beams creaked softer. Wind moved slower through the pine trees outside. Even the lake seemed quieter beneath the thin layer of mountain fog rolling across the shoreline. Deputy Collins sat at my grandfather's dining table flipping carefully through the documents while Ramirez stood near the stone fireplace warming his hands beside the heat. Linda remained near the kitchen counter gripping her wine glass so tightly I noticed the tendons in her hand starting to show. Gone was the polished neighborhood queen smiling for HOA newsletters. Now she looked irritated, cornered. Dangerous in that cold suburban way where people stop pretending to be polite. Collins adjusted the reading glasses low on his nose and studied the property survey under the hanging lantern light. "This says parcel 84 includes the cabin, dock, bridge access road, and both shoreline easements," he said slowly. "Fully private ownership." Linda immediately stepped forward. "Because the community maintained the area for years," she snapped. "Everyone in Pine Hollow understands this property with shared recreational access." Collins looked up at her calmly. "Ma'am, understanding and legal ownership are not the same thing." The silence after that sentence felt heavy enough to crack ice. I walked over to the old iron stove near the wall and poured myself coffee from the pot I left before driving into town earlier that day. The bitter smell filled the room instantly. Same coffee brand Grandpa drank every morning at exactly 6:15 while reading county reports at this very table. He used to say paperwork mattered more than handshakes once money got involved. At the time I thought he sounded paranoid. Turns out old mountain men usually learn lessons the expensive way first. Linda laughed suddenly, sharp and fake. "This is ridiculous," she said. "The HOA has records proving community access." I nodded slowly. You mean the brochures? Her face tightened again. That hit exactly where I wanted it to. Because 6 months earlier, I discovered something interesting while attending one of Pine Hollow's monthly HOA meetings. Linda had been using photographs of my dock and cabin in promotional packets for new buyers. Sunset fishing access, private lake recreation, exclusive community amenities, all carefully worded to imply ownership without ever technically claiming it on paper. Realtors loved it. Property values climbed almost 12% in 2 years. Funny what happens when rich people think they are buying access to a private mountain lake. Ramirez noticed the framed black and white photos sitting beside the fireplace mantel. My grandfather standing beside the cabin in 1974 wearing work gloves and holding the original brass key ring. Your grandfather built this himself? He asked. Every inch, I answered. Took him 3 summers. The deputy nodded quietly. People understood craftsmanship differently in the mountains. Cabins like this were not investments. They were legacy. Linda suddenly set her wine glass down harder than intended against the granite countertop. The sound cracked through the room. Ethan changed those locks specifically to intimidate residents, she said. People have used this property for decades. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. People were invited here, I said calmly. There is a difference. Collins finally closed the deed folder and rested both hands on the table. Mr. Walker, he said carefully, when exactly did you replace the locks? 3 weeks ago. Why? I looked directly at Linda. Because somebody entered the cabin while I was out of town. Neither deputy missed the way her shoulders stiffened immediately. Outside, wind rattled the porch lantern while snow brushed softly against the windows. Collins narrowed his eyes slightly. Do you have security cameras on the property? I reached into my coat pocket and placed a black flash drive beside the deed paperwork. I do now, I said. The tiny black flash drive sat on the table between the deed paperwork and Linda's wine glass like a loaded trap nobody wanted to touch first. Deputy Collins stared at it for a moment while the fire popped softly behind him. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the flashing patrol lights, melting against the cabin windows in thin streams of water. Linda crossed her arms tighter. Security footage does not change the fact that residents have established access, she said sharply. Collins ignored her. What exactly did the cameras record? He asked me. I leaned back against the counter and folded my hands calmly. Depends which night you want to start with. That landed harder than I expected. Even Ramirez looked up immediately. Linda's expression changed again, just for a second. Tiny movements tell you everything when somebody realizes the story is no longer under their control. I walked past the dining table toward the hallway closet and opened the old metal lockbox mounted beside the staircase. The hinges squealed softly. Inside sat backup hard drives, old property maps, and the faded leather notebook my grandfather used to document every repair he ever made around the cabin. The smell of dust and cedar drifted out as I pulled a tablet from the shelf. 3 months ago, I said while powering it on. I came up here for a weekend and found muddy footprints inside the kitchen after being gone for 6 days. Linda immediately scoffed. You live in the mountains, Ethan. Animals get into cabins all the time. Ramirez glanced down at the hardwood floor. Animals wearing hiking boots? Silence. The tablet screen flickered to life. I tapped through the camera folders while the deputies moved closer to the dining table. Linda remained near the counter now, but her confidence had started cracking around the edges. She kept adjusting the sleeve of her sweater repeatedly. Nervous habit. The first video loaded with a faint electronic hum. Timestamp from 6 weeks earlier. Bright afternoon sunlight across the porch. Linda walking directly to the front door carrying a clipboard and 2 people dressed like vacation buyers. She smiled for them while unlocking my cabin with that same brass key. Collins frowned immediately. Is there audio? No, I answered. But keep watching. The footage showed Linda leading the couple through my living room like a real estate tour guide. She pointed toward the lake, opened the stone fireplace doors, even walked upstairs toward the loft bedrooms. 20 minutes later, they exited smiling while Linda handed them HOA brochures beside my truck shed. Ramirez let out a low whistle under his breath. Linda straightened instantly. That was a prospective buyer information tour. Inside somebody else's home? Collins asked quietly. The community has always presented this property as part of the recreational amenities. There it was again. Presented. Not owned. Not leased. Just sold through implication. I loaded another clip. Night footage this time. Grainy snow falling beneath the porch light. Linda arriving with 6 residents carrying folding chairs and coolers during one of Pine Hollow's holiday events. They used my dock, my fire pit, even my grandfather's canoe hanging beside the shoreline rack. One resident slipped while carrying firewood and nearly dropped it into the lake. Linda laughed on camera while unlocking my storage shed. Collins slowly removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The room smelled like burnt oak and cold coffee now. Nobody spoke for several long seconds except the old grandfather clock ticking near the stairs. Then Ramirez noticed something in the footage. "Hold on," he said. "Go back." I rewound the video. Linda froze completely beside the counter. Ramirez pointed toward the bottom corner of the screen where the timestamp showed the exact date. December 14th. Collins looked up at Linda carefully. "Ma'am," he said, "according to your complaint tonight, Mr. Walker illegally changed these locks 3 weeks ago." Linda swallowed once. "Correct." Collins nodded slowly. "Then how did you unlock the storage shed 4 days ago?" The sound of the wind outside suddenly felt louder after Deputy Collins asked that question. Snow brushed softly across the porch roof while the patrol lights flashed through the trees in slow pulses of blue and red. Linda opened her mouth twice before any words came out. "I have several copies of older access keys," she finally said. Her voice sounded tighter now, less polished. Collins leaned back in the dining chair and folded his hands across the deed paperwork. "You just stated Mr. Walker changed every lock 3 weeks ago." Linda nodded carefully. "Yes." "Then older keys would not work anymore." Silence again. Real silence this time. The kind that settles into a room once somebody realizes they are standing on thin ice, and everyone else just heard it crack. I took another sip of coffee while watching steam rise from the mug into the warm cabin air. Linda avoided looking at me now. Instead, she stared at the security footage paused on the screen beside the timestamp. December 14th. 4 days earlier. Her standing beside my storage shed with a key that should not have existed anymore. Deputy Ramirez walked slowly toward the hallway where the bedrooms sat beyond the staircase. "You said she had access to your bedroom too?" he asked. "Not anymore," I answered. "That lock was changed first." Ramirez nodded and glanced toward Linda. "You tried using an old key there too?" "I was checking the property," she snapped immediately. "For HOA compliance." Collins let out a slow breath through his nose. "Ma'am, this is not HOA property." Her composure finally cracked all the way after that. "Do you have any idea how much this community depends on that lake access?" she fired back. "People bought homes here because of those amenities. The previous owner understood that." Previous owner. Not Ethan. Not legal owner. Just another little trick people use when they want your property to sound temporary. I set the mug down beside the fireplace and looked directly at her. "My grandfather gave neighbors permission to fish," I said calmly. "He never transferred ownership." "Verbal agreements still matter," Linda argued. Collins shook his head immediately. "Not against recorded deed law, they do not." That sentence hit the room like a hammer. Linda's shoulders dropped slightly for the first time all night. Outside, another gust rattled the porch lantern while freezing wind pushed smoke sideways across the chimney. The cabin smelled heavier now. Burnt cedar, wet wool, cold air sneaking beneath the old doorframe. Collins reopened the deed packet and slid one document closer under the lantern light. "What exactly is this?" he asked. I stepped over beside the table. "That," I said, "is why I replaced every lock on the property." The page was yellowed with age, edges curled slightly from decades inside county archives. At the top sat my grandfather's signature dated 8 years earlier. Beneath it was a formal revocation notice addressed directly to Pine Hollow Homeowners Association. Linda went completely still. Ramirez looked between us carefully. "Revocation of all temporary recreational permissions," Collins read aloud slowly. "Effective immediately due to unauthorized use, liability concerns, and repeated misuse of private property access." The deputy looked up at Linda. "You knew about this?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "The board disputed it." I almost laughed hearing that. Disputed it. Like HOA opinions somehow outranked county property law. "You never filed a response," I said quietly. "Because your attorney told you the document was enforceable." Linda's eyes snapped toward me instantly. There it was. The look people get when they realize you know exactly how deep the problem goes. 3 months earlier, I tracked down Pine Hollow's former legal consultant after noticing his name disappear from HOA meeting minutes. Retired attorney named Harold Beckett, living 20 miles north near the river basin. We sat on his porch drinking stale coffee while rain hammered the tin roof overhead. Beckett told me everything. Linda ignored the revocation because admitting it existed would collapse half the property value promises Pine Hollow used to attract wealthy buyers. Suddenly, the entire cabin felt smaller, tighter. Collins slowly removed his glasses again while staring at Linda across the dining table. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this is beginning to look less like a misunderstanding and more like unlawful access to private property." Linda's face lost all color after Deputy Collins said the words unlawful access. Not angry anymore. Not confident either. Just calculating. The way people look when they are mentally flipping through every excuse they have left and realizing none of them sound legal enough. The fire crackled low behind us while wind pushed another wave of snow against the windows. Pine branches scraped softly across the roof overhead. I could smell cold air leaking through the old stone chimney, mixed with Linda's expensive perfume and the burnt cedar logs glowing inside the fireplace. Collins stayed calm, but his entire tone had shifted. No more neighborhood dispute voice. Now he sounded procedural, careful, official. "Ma'am," he said, "did the HOA ever file this revocation with county mediation?" Linda hesitated too long before answering. "The board considered it invalid." "That is not what I asked." Silence again. Ramirez crossed his arms near the staircase while studying the tablet footage still frozen on screen. "You brought strangers into this cabin?" he asked her. "Potential buyers," Linda corrected immediately. "Future residents." "Without permission from the owner." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Collins slowly stacked the paperwork together while the old grandfather clock ticked through the room 1 heavy second at a time. "Mr. Walker," he asked, "how long has this been happening?" I looked around the cabin before answering. The worn leather chair near the fireplace. Grandpa's fishing rods hanging above the windows. The deep scratches across the pine table where he cleaned trout for 30 years. Every inch of that cabin carried memories. And for years Linda treated it like bonus square footage for HOA marketing brochures. "Long enough?" I said quietly. The truth was I started noticing little things almost a year earlier. Empty beer bottles in the dock trash bin after weekends I was not there. Fresh tire tracks near the bridge gate. Towels missing from the laundry room. Somebody even replaced the old lake map hanging in the hallway with a framed Pine Hollow community sign, like they were slowly trying to rewrite ownership one detail at a time. At first I thought it was entitled neighbors crossing boundaries. Then I found the reservation emails. That changed everything. 2 months earlier, I drove to the cabin unexpectedly during a Thursday rainstorm after a consulting job got canceled in Denver. I still remember the smell when I opened the front door that afternoon. Lemon cleaner. Fresh towels. Vanilla candles burning inside my kitchen. The cabin looked staged, like a vacation rental brochure. Sitting on the counter was an HOA welcome packet beside a handwritten note reading, "Lakefront access available until Sunday checkout." Checkout. In my family cabin. Collins looked up sharply when I told him that part. "You were saying the HOA was letting people stay here?" "Not officially," I answered. "Officially, they called it temporary recreational access." Ramirez shook his head slowly under his breath. Linda stepped forward suddenly. "Nobody stayed overnight without supervision," she snapped. "Wrong thing to say?" Collins caught it immediately. "Without supervision?" Her eyes widened just slightly. Too late. He leaned back in the chair and stared at her carefully. "So you admit the HOA coordinated access?" The room went dead quiet except for the hiss of burning logs inside the fireplace. Outside, one of the patrol radios crackled faintly through the snowy darkness. Linda rubbed both hands together now, trying to recover. "People expected lake privileges when they moved here," she said weakly. "Property values depended on it." There it was. Finally, the real reason. Not community traditions. Not neighborly sharing. Money. Pine Hollow sold itself as an exclusive mountain lake neighborhood, but the truth sitting right there on the county deed was simple. The lake access everyone thought they owned ran directly through my grandfather's private property. Collins looked down at the revocation notice again. "And when Mr. Walker changed the locks," he said carefully, "your buyers lost the access you promised them." Linda said nothing this time. She did not need to. Her silence confirmed everything. I walked over to the window beside the fireplace and looked out toward the frozen dock stretching into the dark lake water. Snow drifted softly beneath the moonlight, while the new steel lock on the dock gate reflected silver under the patrol lights outside. Grandpa always said locks existed for honest people first. Turns out he was right about that, too. By 2:30 in the morning, the storm had settled fully over Pine Hollow. Snow buried the gravel driveway in a thin white layer while freezing wind rolled across the lake hard enough to make the dock chains rattle below the cabin. Deputy Collins stood near the front window speaking quietly into his radio, while Ramirez finished photographing the paperwork spread across my grandfather's table. Linda sat stiffly beside the fireplace now, both hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee she never drank. Her wine glass still sat abandoned near the counter where everything started unraveling. Funny how quickly confidence disappears once paperwork enters the room. Collins finally clipped the radio back onto his shoulder and looked toward me. County records confirmed the revocation filing, he said. Filed 8 years ago exactly like the document states. Linda shut her eyes for one brief second. There it was again. Not surprise. Recognition. She already knew. Collins continued carefully. There is also no recorded easement granting HOA access to this property. Ramirez leaned against the staircase railing, meaning every community event here happened without legal authorization. The fire popped loudly inside the stone hearth. Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. Then Linda finally exhaled hard through her nose and muttered something under her breath I could not fully hear. Probably because there was no clean way out anymore. Every path led back to the same problem. She built Pine Hollow's luxury image around lake access she never legally controlled. I walked toward the hallway and opened the narrow utility closet beside the laundry room. The smell of machine oil and old cedar drifted out immediately. Hanging inside was the original key rack my grandfather built by hand sometime around 1980. Most hooks sat empty now except for one faded brass tag labeled Dock Gate. Collins stepped closer to inspect it. Your grandfather kept records of the keys? He asked. Every copy ever made, I answered. I pulled a weathered notebook from the shelf beneath the rack. Inside were handwritten entries going back decades. Neighbor names, temporary fishing permissions, return dates. Every single key documented in Grandpa's neat block lettering. Ramirez flipped carefully through the pages under the flashlight beam. Looks like he stopped issuing community copies 9 years ago. Right before the revocation, I said. Collins glanced toward Linda again. Then where exactly did your current key come from? She stayed silent. The deputies waited. Wind hissed through the chimney outside, while snow tapped softly against the windows. Finally, Linda looked up at me instead of the officers. Your grandfather gave me one personally, she said quietly. I nodded slowly, and he asked for it back. That landed harder than anything else that night because it was true. I still remembered the argument. Summer evening. Orange sunset across the lake. Grandpa sitting on the dock in his old canvas jacket while Linda stood near the shoreline complaining about new homeowners wanting guaranteed recreational access. He told her directly the cabin was never part of Pine Hollow amenities. She smiled through the entire conversation like she was listening politely. Then she kept using the key anyway. Collins rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. So after the owner revoked access, you continued entering the property and presenting it as a community feature. Linda's voice turned sharp again instantly. People expected it. Expectation does not create ownership, Collins replied. The room fell quiet once more except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. I walked over to the front window, overlooking the frozen shoreline below. The new dock lock reflected silver beneath the moonlight, while patrol lights flashed softly across the snow. 3 weeks earlier, I stood out there in 20-degree weather replacing every chain and deadbolt myself. Drill humming through the darkness. Steel biting into frozen wood. I remember the exact feeling when the final lock clicked shut. Not anger. Relief. Like the cabin could finally breathe again after years of strangers walking through it pretending history belonged to whoever printed the nicest HOA brochure. Behind me, Collins closed the deed folder and looked directly at Linda. Ma'am, he said carefully, I strongly suggest Pine Hollow stops advertising this property immediately. Linda stared into the fire without answering. And for the first time since I met her, the silence belonged entirely to me. The deputies finally left the cabin a little after 3 in the morning. Their headlights disappeared slowly through the snow-covered trees while the sound of tires crunching over frozen gravel faded down the mountain road toward Pine Hollow. Linda stood silently on the porch the entire time, wrapped in her cream-colored coat, staring out at the lake like she was trying to calculate how much damage one steel lock had just caused. Collins paused beside his patrol vehicle before leaving and handed me a folded incident report. "For documentation purposes," he said. "And Mr. Walker?" I looked up. His breath drifted white through the freezing air. "You were absolutely within your legal rights to change every lock on this property." Linda heard every word. I could tell by the way her jaw tightened under the porch light. Then the patrol cars disappeared into the storm, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the pines and the soft groan of frozen dock chains below the hill. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The porch boards creaked under our boots while snowflakes melted against the warm lantern glass overhead. Finally, Linda spoke without looking at me. "You have no idea what this is going to do to Pine Hollow." I slid the incident report into my coat pocket. "No," I answered calmly. "You did that." She turned toward me sharply then, eyes tired now instead of angry. "People paid premium prices because of that lake access. Then maybe you should not have sold them something you did not own." The silence afterward felt colder than the mountain air. Linda stared past me into the cabin where my grandfather's old clock still ticked steadily through the room. Then she said something that explained everything better than any document ever could. Nobody would have bought here otherwise. There it was. The entire scam reduced to one exhausted sentence. Pine Hollow was never really about mountain living or quiet lake communities. It was about inflated property values wrapped in fake exclusivity. Linda and the board sold people an image. Private access, community shoreline, shared cabin privileges. And for years nobody questioned it because wealthy homeowners rarely ask who owns something once they think their HOA fees already paid for it. I watched snow drift across the frozen lake while memories came back in pieces. Grandpa repairing fishing reels on the dock. Summer mornings smelling like pine sap and black coffee. The sound of loons echoing across the water before luxury homes covered the hillsides. Back then, nobody cared about access rights because neighbors still respected boundaries without lawyers involved. Then came Pine Hollow. Gates, committees, compliance letters, golf carts with HOA decals driving around like tiny suburban police cruisers. 3 days after that night, the fallout started. First came the emergency HOA meeting. Then the emails. Then the panic. Residents discovered the lake access advertised in their property packets had never legally existed. Several homeowners demanded refunds on special assessment fees used to maintain recreational amenities. One retired couple threatened litigation after learning their real estate agent promised guaranteed dock privileges during closing. Apparently, that conversation was recorded. Funny how documentation suddenly matters once rich people feel misled. By Friday morning, the county zoning office opened a formal review into Pine Hollow's promotional materials. Harold Beckett called me from his porch overlooking the river basin while I was replacing the final padlock on the lower bridge gate. "Told you they would implode," he said between coughs. "HOAs survive on perception. Once trust cracks, everybody starts digging through paperwork." He was right. Residents began questioning everything. Landscaping contracts, reserve fund spending, maintenance fees. One homeowner even discovered HOA money had been used to repair my dock 2 years earlier without legal ownership approval. That one spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Linda resigned 4 days later. No dramatic speech. No apology. Just a short email citing personal stress and community tensions. The woman who spent years acting like Queen of Pine Hollow vanished before the first real audit even started. That Sunday morning, I walked down to the shoreline alone, carrying a fresh thermos of coffee while light snow drifted quietly across the lake. The new steel lock hung from the dock gate exactly where I left it. Cold, solid, legal. I reached down and clicked it shut one more time just to hear the sound echo across the frozen water. Winter settled fully over Pine Hollow after that. The tourists disappeared first. Then the luxury real estate signs started coming down one by one along the mountain roads circling the lake. By January, half the neighborhood looked quieter than I had ever seen it. No more golf carts cruising past my bridge gate. No more strangers wandering onto the dock pretending they belonged there. Just snow, pine trees, and the sound of the lake breathing beneath the ice every morning before sunrise. I spent most of that winter repairing things around the cabin my grandfather never quite finished before he passed away. Loose deck boards, window seals, the old canoe rack near the shoreline. Honest work, the kind that leaves sawdust on your boots and keeps your mind quiet. Sometimes I would catch myself stopping halfway through a project just to listen. No HOA meetings echoing from the lodge down the road. No fake community events near the dock. No voices outside my windows at midnight. Silence finally sounded like home again. The county investigation kept spreading long after Linda disappeared from Pine Hollow. Turns out once auditors started reviewing HOA finances, they uncovered years of spending tied directly to recreational property improvements on land the association never legally controlled. Dock repairs, landscaping, security lighting, even insurance policies listing my cabin as a shared community structure. Every new document made the board look worse. Several homeowners filed civil complaints against the association after discovering their property values had been artificially inflated through misleading advertising. One family from Arizona apparently paid almost $80,000 above market price because they believed lake access came with their purchase agreement. The realtor involved blamed Linda immediately. Funny how fast loyalty disappears once lawyers arrive. I only saw Linda one more time after the night the deputies came to the cabin. Late February, cold gray afternoon. I was carrying lumber from my truck when a black SUV rolled slowly to the bridge entrance and stopped beside the new gate. The engine idled quietly while snow drifted through the air between us. Linda stepped out wearing a long wool coat and gloves dark enough to blend into the overcast sky. She looked older somehow, tired around the eyes. Not defeated exactly, just smaller without the HOA behind her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Wind moved softly through the trees while the steel chain across the bridge rattled against the posts. Then she glanced toward the cabin sitting above the frozen shoreline and sighed. "You know," she said quietly, "your grandfather used to let people fish here all summer." I nodded once, when they respected the place. She looked down at the lock hanging from the gate, the same silver steel lock that started the entire collapse. I really thought the community needed it more than one person did. I rested both hands against the lumber stack in my truck bed and looked past her toward the lake. "That was the problem," I said calmly. "You stopped seeing it as somebody's home." Linda stood there another few seconds before returning to the SUV without another word. The tires crunched softly over snow as she disappeared down the mountain road for the last time. Spring arrived slowly after that. Ice melted off the lake in long cracking sheets while rain soaked the pine forest until the entire mountain smelled like wet earth and cedar bark. One evening in April, I sat alone on the dock with a cup of black coffee, watching sunset burn orange across the water exactly the way Grandpa used to. The cabin behind me glowed warm beneath the trees. Quiet. Protected. Mine. I reached over and locked the dock gate before heading inside for the night. The steel clicked softly in the mountain silence, clean and final. Grandpa used to say ownership is not about who uses the land. It is about who protects it when everybody else forgets where the boundary is. Turns out he was right about that too.